A Christian preacher, known for his arrogance, issued a public challenge. He claimed that in just 10 minutes he could make any Muslim doubt their faith. He was convinced that no opponent would be able to face him. What he didn't expect was that a young Muslim student would dare to accept his challenge, even though many mocked him for daring. The debate was as intense as it was surprising. Who do you think managed to convince the other? Join us in this story filled with tension and faith. And who knows, maybe those who watch this video will also find a positive transformation in their lives. The lecture hall was packed. Students, scholars, and guests had gathered to attend the pastor's long-awaited seminar. Gabriel, a renowned Christian orator, famous for never losing a debate. He wore a white robe with gold trim and stood tall at the lectern with a confident, penetrating gaze. He radiated confidence. The atmosphere was noisy and charged with anticipation. Most of the audience was hoping to see the pastor once again ridicule his opponent, as he had done on other occasions. In a powerful and defiant voice, Gabriel took the floor. Today I will prove to you that Islam is nothing but a mirage, and whoever dares to debate me, I will make them lose their faith in just 10 minutes. His statement was met with laughter and applause from many in the audience. Eyes darted around the audience, waiting to see who would be brave or naive enough to accept the challenge. Then, silence fell over the room. A hand timidly rose from the crowd. It was a young student, dressed in a hijab, with a serene face and a determined gaze. Her name was Camila, and studied Islamic theology. Although many knew her for her humble nature, they also knew she had a deep and solid understanding of her faith. Murmurs began immediately. Some laughed disdainfully, convinced that the girl had no chance against the experienced speaker. Pastor Gabriel also smiled mockingly at the sight. A young woman. Will she be the one trying to debate me? This will be easier than I imagined, he said ironically. Some people laughed at her comment, but Camila wasn't intimidated. She stood firm, hands clasped in front of her, not showing a trace of fear. Her calm, confident presence slowly drowned out the laughter and generated an increasingly attentive silence. I'm not here to win a debate, Pastor, Camila said softly but firmly. I just want to answer your challenge with the truth I believe in. The atmosphere in the room changed. There was something in her tone that captured everyone's attention. Her words carried a special weight, as if backed by unwavering faith. Some began to whisper, noticing that this young woman was not a simple student, but someone with true conviction. Gabriel raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised by Camila's calm. But he wouldn't allow a young woman to ruin his reputation. With confident steps, he prepared to launch his first argument. Okay, Camila, the pastor said defiantly, if you're truly convinced of your faith, let's see if you can last more than 10 minutes in this debate. The audience's laughter and murmurs filled the room once more. Thus began an exchange of ideas that would leave everyone speechless. The shepherd Gabriel approached the edge of the podium. His eyes shone with determination, and in a firm voice, he asked his first question. If Islam is the true religion, why didn't the Prophet Muhammad perform miracles like Jesus, who healed the sick and raised the dead? Camila smiled serenely. Without hesitation, she calmly replied, miracles aren't the only indicator of a prophet's truthfulness. Each messenger was granted a miracle appropriate to the circumstances of his time. Moses was given the power to part the sea because magic was prevalent in his time. Jesus was allowed to heal the sick because medicine played a significant role in his time. The Prophet Muhammad, on the other hand, was given an eternal miracle, the Quran, which to this day no one has been able to equal. His voice was calm but confident. Every word seemed to resonate deeply with the audience. Pastor Gabriel forced a smile. If you say the Quran is a miracle, how do you explain why so many people don't believe in it? Shouldn't miracles make everyone believe? Camila nodded in understanding and replied, miracles don't guarantee faith. Even in the time of Moses, many disobeyed despite seeing the sea parting before them. And in the time of Jesus, although he healed the blind, he was rejected by many. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 6 and 7, it is mentioned that those with closed hearts will not believe, no matter how many signs are given to them. At that moment, some of the audience, who had previously been laughing, began to nod respectfully. The clarity of Camilla's answers had made them reflect. Gabriel frowned. He hadn't expected the young woman to remain so calm or to answer so firmly. Then he asked another question. If God is one, why does he refer to himself with the word "we" in the Quran? Doesn't that suggest that he is more than one? Camilla smiled again, as if she already knew this would come up. In Arabic, as in other languages, the use of "we" can also be a form of respect and grandeur, not necessarily plurality. Like when a king says, "we command," even when he speaks alone. Even in the Bible, in Genesis, it says, "Let us make man in our image and likeness." Does that mean there is more than one God in Christianity? The pastor opened his mouth, but couldn't respond immediately. The audience, already attentive, erupted in cheers at the soundness of the argument. Camilla not only defended her faith, but also cleverly turned the questions around. However, Gabriel wouldn't give up so easily. Straightening, he asked another question. If Islam is true, how can it claim that the Bible has been altered? Shouldn't the Word of God be eternal and unalterable? Camilla sighed before answering. Even in the Bible itself, there is evidence of human modifications. In Jeremiah 8, it says, "How can they say that we are wise and have the law of the Lord, when the lying pen of the scribes has falsified it?" This indicates that there have been changes over time, made by human hands. The audience fell silent. Camilla's words were not only clear, but also accompanied by precise knowledge. And each answer further shook the preacher's confidence. This confirms that there were alterations, Camilla added. Even the Quran mentions it in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 79, where it warns against those who write texts with their own hands and then claim they come from God. The shepherd Gabriel, he fell silent. A drop of sweat trickled down his forehead. He searched for words in his mind, but the more he tried, the more he felt his arguments begin to crumble. The audience, which had been laughing before, now looked at him differently. Some noticed the change in his expression. Camilla, on the other hand, remained firm, serene, and self-assured. The debate had barely begun, but many minds and hearts were already beginning to stir inside. The auditorium continued to vibrate with timid applause and whispered conversations. Pastor Gabriel, determined not to be defeated, raised his hand to request silence. When the murmur subsided, he approached the lectern with a sarcastic smile and asked his next question. "Okay, let's get down to something simple," he said with feigned gentleness. The Prophet Muhammad claimed to be the last messenger of God. But how could someone illiterate have produced a book as complex as the Quran? Wouldn't it be more logical to think it was a human invention, perhaps by someone very clever? Laughter erupted from various parts of the room. Some thought the young woman would be beyond words. But Camilla didn't flinch. In a calm voice, she replied, "Reverend, that question, far from weakening my position, actually confirms the divine origin of the Quran. If the Prophet Muhammad could neither read nor write, how could he have produced a text with such beautiful language, such balanced laws, and scientific details that were only discovered centuries later? Even the greatest poets and scientists of history have not been able to replicate a single chapter with the depth and style of the Quran," he added. And in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 23, an open challenge is issued, "If you doubt what we have revealed to our servant, bring a surah like it, and call your witnesses if you are truthful." To this day, no one has been able to accept that challenge. Isn't this proof that it does not come from a human being? The previously skeptical class began to lean in her favor. Some students who had previously underestimated her now nodded silently, impressed by the logic and composure of her reasoning. Pastor Gabriel remained silent for a few seconds, but soon regained his confident tone. He wasn't about to lose so easily. "Okay, tell me then," he continued in a higher-pitched voice, trying to regain control. "If Islam is the true religion, how can it justify polygamy? Isn't that a way of degrading women and treating them as mere objects? How can that be defended?" Applause rang out from her supporters. They thought this question would trap Camilla with no way out. But once again, she responded calmly, even with a slight smile. Reverend, before discussing polygamy in Islam, let's review Old Testament history. Prophets like Abraham, Moses, and David also had multiple wives. Why isn't this questioned in other religions? Islam didn't invent polygamy, he continued, but rather imposed limits on it. Unlike other times when men took as many wives as they wanted, the Quran sets clear conditions. There must be absolute justice between wives, and if a man can't guarantee that, then he must keep only one. As mentioned in Surah An-Nisa. The audience fell silent. The laughter was gone. Camilla's words were not only firm, but deeply reasoned and respectful. The atmosphere of the debate had transformed. It was no longer a spectacle, but an exchange that touched the deepest thoughts of those present. In verse 3 of Surah An-Nisa, Camilla began in a calm voice, God says, "If you fear that you will not be just to orphans by marrying them, marry other women of your choice. 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, marry only one." Doesn't this demonstrate, he added, that Islam doesn't promote indiscriminate polygamy, but rather makes it conditional on justice? And if that justice can't be guaranteed, then the right thing to do is to marry only one woman. Isn't this a clear protection of women's rights? The room fell completely silent again. Many of those who had previously applauded the pastor now looked at Camilla with a mixture of surprise and reflection. She spoke not only logically, but also knowledgeably, backing everything up with sacred texts and history. The shepherd Gabriel, he was beginning to feel cornered. Still, his face showed no sign of surrender. He took a deep breath and, in a more stern tone, asked another question. Okay, then answer me this. If God is loving and merciful, as you claim, why is there such a terrible punishment as hell in Islam? Doesn't that contradict his love? Why would a compassionate God punish his creatures with such cruel suffering? It was an emotional question, one that usually struck a chord with even the most sensitive of hearts. Some in the audience nodded, thinking Camilla would hesitate this time. But she just smiled calmly. She had been expecting that question. Pastor, he began, true love doesn't eliminate justice. I ask, if a person kills thousands of innocent people, would it be just to leave them unpunished? If a dictator steals and destroys the lives of an entire people, should they go unpunished? Even under human laws, crime is punishable. Why would it be any different with God? He has given every human being free will to choose between good and evil. But he has also made it clear that every choice has a consequence. In the Quran, Surah Al-Ghafir, verse 60, it says, "Call upon me, and I will answer. But those who are too proud to worship me will enter hell in humiliation." Hell, he added, doesn't exist because God lacks mercy. It exists because there are those who reject that mercy again and again, by their own choice. Pastor Gabriel swallowed. Camilla's confidence was starting to make him uncomfortable. He looked at the audience. Their reactions were changing. They were no longer mocking smiles, but attentive glances, some even astonished. Camilla then stepped forward and, without waiting for the next question, looked directly at the pastor. "Now, with your permission, I want to ask you a question, Pastor." Gabriel looked at her, surprised. "If Jesus is truly God," he said in a firm voice, "why does the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 24, verse 36, clearly say that no one knows the day or the hour, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father? If Jesus is God, how could he not know something that God knows?" The shepherd froze. That question struck him hard. He tried to answer, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, his confidence wavered. The entire audience became expectant. A deep silence fell. The tension was palpable. Gabriel stood still. A cold sweat ran down his back. Every argument he threw around seemed to crumble in the face of Camilla's calm and forceful responses. What had begun as just another debate had now become an unforgettable moment. The audience was no longer watching only with their ears, but also with their hearts. Before, many had laughed at Camilla. Now, they listened to her with respect, even some students who had previously underestimated her. The lecturers present exchanged glances, and some nodded in recognition of the clarity of her reasoning. Pastor Gabriel, aware that his reputation was at stake, tried to calm his nerves. He couldn't allow a young student to outdo him on a stage he knew like the back of his hand. With a slightly trembling voice, he asked another question. If Islam is the true religion, why did Muhammad marry so many women? Isn't that a sign that he wasn't a holy man? Camila responded with a slight smile. Good question, Pastor. The Prophet Muhammad didn't marry out of desire or lust. Before becoming a prophet, he had only one wife, Khadijah, and she remained faithful to him for more than 2 decades, until his death. After her, his marriages were for humanitarian, social, and political reasons. For example, one of his wives was an elderly widow whose husband had fallen in battle. Other unions served to create alliances between warring tribes, facilitating peace. And if his intention had been desire, why did he choose older women, widows, and even orphans, and not young girls? Gabriel choked on the answer. It was clear, reasoned, and difficult to refute. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. And how do you explain then, he replied, that there is a revelation that allows him to marry more women? Camila sighed softly. Pastor, if we look at the Bible, we'll see that many earlier prophets also had multiple wives. Abraham was married to Sarah and Hagar. David had many wives, and the prophet Solomon had hundreds. So if we're going to question the prophet Muhammad for that, shouldn't we also question those prophets that even you consider saints? Once again, the pastor was speechless. The audience was beginning to lean toward Camila. Some of the students who had previously supported the pastor now exchanged anxious glances. Gabriel, in a last attempt, asked his strongest question. Okay, if Islam is true, how come you call Jesus a prophet when the Bible clearly calls him God? Didn't he say, I am the way, the truth, and the life? Camila looked at him with tenderness, not with arrogance. Pastor, do you know that Jesus, in the entire Bible, never explicitly said, I am God. Worship me. On the contrary, in John 17 verse 3, Jesus said that the only true God is the Father. And in Mark 12 verse 29, he reaffirms the monotheism taught by Moses, saying, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. If Jesus recognized that God is one, and referred to him as someone distinct from himself, how then can we say that he is God? Gabriel felt a knot in his chest. He wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. He searched his mind for a verse that might refute Camila, but the more he thought, the more insecure he felt. The entire room held its breath. It was a moment no one expected to witness. Pastor Gabriel, known for dominating every debate, was now completely silent. A few seconds passed that seemed like an eternity. Finally, the pastor lowered his head. A tremor ran through his body. He had studied Christianity all his life, but for the first time, real doubt had taken root in his heart. Camila stood there, not triumphantly, only compassionately. She looked at the pastor and said gently, Pastor, I'm not here to beat you. I'm here just to share the truth I believe in. That truth doesn't belong to me, it belongs to God. The audience, which minutes before had been thundering with applause and cheers, was now completely silent. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a reflective silence. The silence of minds beginning to question themselves, of hearts beginning to open. The pastor's face flushed, not with anger, but with emotion. Something deep inside him was beginning to burn. He had always felt invincible in debates. But this time, it wasn't about winning. It was something deeper. It was about the truth. Every question hurled at Camila was answered with admirable serenity. She didn't just answer, she dismantled the argument with such clear logic that it seemed impossible to refute. Pastor Gabriel, visibly uneasy, watched her, desperately trying to find some weak spot, some crack that would allow him to counterattack. So tell me this, he said, his voice strained. If Islam is the true religion, why are so many Muslims poor or oppressed? If God really is all-powerful, why does he allow his own followers to suffer? Camila maintained her calm smile. Her gaze reflected compassion rather than confrontation. Difficulties, Pastor, are part of the human experience. In the Quran, in the second surah, Al-Baqarah, verses 155 and 156, God already warns that He will test people with fear, hunger, and loss. But He also says that those who are patient and steadfast will receive a great reward. If suffering were a sign of religious falsehood, then how do we explain the pain the prophets experienced? Moses was expelled from his homeland. Jesus was rejected and persecuted. Even the Prophet Muhammad and his followers were harshly oppressed in Mecca before Islam flourished. Suffering isn't proof that a religion is wrong. It's a test of faith. And only those who persevere are worthy of understanding its purpose. Once again, the room fell silent. That answer was not only logical, but it seemed to touch something deeper in the hearts of those who heard it. Even the most skeptical faces began to soften. Pastor Gabriel, however, didn't give up. Although something inside was beginning to shake, there was still fight in his voice. "So explain this to me," he persisted. "Why does Islam reject Jesus as God? Didn't He say in the Bible that the Father and I are one?" Camila looked at him with empathy. It wasn't the look of someone seeking to humiliate, but rather that of someone who understands an internal struggle. "Pastor, let me ask you something," he said gently. "If Jesus were really God, why is He shown in the Bible praying to someone else? In Matthew 27 verse 46, when He was on the cross, He cried out, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' Who was He talking to if He Himself was God? And in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus Himself says that the Father is greater than Him. How can someone be God if they admit that there is someone greater than them?" The pastor's face changed. He had read those passages, but had never seen them in that light. A cold sweat began to run down his forehead. Something deep inside him was stirring. A disturbing thought began to surface. What if he had been ignoring something all this time? Camila continued. In the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 116, there is a mention of a conversation between God and Jesus on the Day of Judgment. God asks him, "Did you tell people to worship you and your mother as gods besides me?" And Jesus replies, "Glory to you. I did not say anything that was not appropriate for me. I only said what you commanded me, to worship you, the one God." This proves that even Jesus, according to Islam, never claimed divinity. He was a faithful servant of God, a messenger sent to guide His people. Pastor Gabriel trembled. He wanted to respond, but his voice cracked. A lifetime of defending his faith, and now he found himself questioning what he had always believed to be undeniable. The foundations of his certainty were beginning to crumble. The audience watched in total silence, witnessing a moment that transcended a simple debate. It was the image of a man, once as steadfast as a rock, now caught in a whirlwind of emotions. A pastor who had won every argument, but now faced not an opponent, but his own conscience. Gabriel lowered his head. The weight of every word Camila spoke resonated in his mind. Camila, for her part, remained motionless, needing nothing more to say. She knew that the important thing was no longer to convince, but to allow the truth to find a place in the heart of her interlocutor. Then something happened that no one had anticipated. Pastor Gabriel, who until recently had held his ground, looked up at Camila, his eyes reddened with tears. He breathed deeply, as if freeing himself from years of internal burden, and with a voice cracking with emotion, said, "Camila, I can no longer deny what you've said. I've dedicated my entire life to searching for the truth, but I recognize that I've been blind. Tonight, for the first time, I see it clearly." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. The astonishment was palpable. Whispers of disbelief could be heard among the audience. No one could believe what they were witnessing. The renowned pastor, famous for never losing a debate, now recognized the power of the words of a young Muslim student. Gabriel looked up at the ceiling, as if seeking some final confirmation from the depths of his soul. Then, he stepped down from the platform with determined steps and approached Camila. His voice, now filled with sincerity and humility, spoke directly to her heart. "Camila, I want to ask you something. If I want to embrace Islam, what should I do?" Camila, moved to tears, smiled softly. Her emotion was evident, but her voice remained firm as she replied. "To enter Islam, you only need to sincerely utter these words, with complete faith in your heart. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger." Pastor Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his courage, while everyone present held their breath. Then, he looked at the audience, raised his voice decisively, and declared, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger." The room erupted. Some were crying, others were exclaiming loudly, unable to process what they had just seen. The man who for years had been a staunch opponent of Islam had now embraced the faith he had so often defied. Camila bowed her head humbly, thanking God for having guided that heart. She knew that what had happened that night wasn't about winning an argument. It was about something much bigger, the beginning of a new path for someone who, after a long search, had finally found the light. The newly converted brother, formerly known as the unbeatable Pastor Gabriel, could no longer contain his emotions. Tears streamed down his face as he felt a heavy burden, which had accompanied him his entire life, melt away. For the first time, he experienced a deep and true peace. That same night, what began as a debate ended as a transformation. A life was changed forever, not by the clash of arguments, but by the sincerity of a search and the clarity of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The story of the grandmother and the white monkey. In a remote corner of the world, at the foot of a misty mountain, lay a small village surrounded by the jungle. There lived an elderly woman, known to all as Dona Rosa. She had been forgotten by her children for several years, and since then, she had lived a solitary life in a humble wooden house near the edge of the forest. Although she lived on the bare minimum, Dona Rosa was strong and determined. Every morning at dawn, she would set out with her cane and a cloth bag to collect firewood, which she would later sell at the market to buy her daily bread. She walked through the morning mist, accompanied only by the creaking of branches and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. One morning, while she was gathering dry sticks, a strange sound interrupted her routine. It was a soft moan, almost a cry, that seemed to come from the bushes. Intrigued, Dona Rosa stopped. She strained her ears and listened again, a high-pitched moan, as if someone were suffering. Without hesitation, she went into the bushes, pushing aside branches with her cane, until she saw it. There, in a forest clearing, trembling on the damp earth, lay a small white creature. It was a baby monkey, hurt and scared. Its fragile body trembled from the cold and fear. It covered its face with its tiny hands, trying to protect itself from the world. Dona Rosa's heart sank at the sight of it so defenseless. With slow movements and a soft voice, she crouched down in front of the little animal. At first, the monkey let out a weak growl, trying to push her away. But she, with a sweet smile, whispered, "Calm down, I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." The little boy slowly stopped crying. His eyes met the old woman's, and in that instant he seemed to understand that she wasn't a threat. Dona Rosa gently picked him up, holding him close to her chest. The little animal, still trembling, clung to her arm, seeking warmth. On the way back, she spoke to him affectionately, as if he were a child. When they arrived home, she improvised a warm corner for him to rest. She named him Lucas, hoping it would bring him strength and luck. From that day on, he became her new companion. Dona Rosa cared for Lucas with immense love, as if he were her own flesh and blood. She fed him, protected him, and took him with her everywhere. The monkey, who was shy and quiet at first, soon began to show signs of joy. Sometimes he climbed onto her shoulder, other times he played in the yard or swung between the nearby branches. The silence of the house was replaced by Lucas's laughter, mischief, and tenderness. The presence of that little white creature changed Dona Rosa's life. They both found companionship in the midst of loneliness, and a bond grew between them that seemed unbreakable. Lucas's loyalty. Dona Rosa's life, once marked by loneliness, began to transform with the arrival of Lucas, the little white monkey who became her shadow and her joy. As the days passed, Their bond grew stronger. Lucas happily followed her into the forest every morning, curious about everything she did and willing to help her with every task. No one in the village would have imagined that the chance encounter between an old woman and a wounded animal would develop into such a deep friendship. For Dona Rosa, Lucas was much more than a companion. He was a gift from nature that gave her back her zest for life. Time passed, and Lucas stopped being the fragile baby who trembled with fear. He grew into a monkey of imposing size, almost as tall as an adult, with amazing strength and a kind heart. His appearance might seem intimidating to some, but to Dona Rosa, he was always her child, her protector. Every day, Lucas carried the heaviest logs, helped tie the bundles of firewood, and even fetched water from the river in a small bucket he handled with care. The most surprising thing wasn't his strength, but his intelligence. He understood every instruction Dona Rosa gave him, as if he could read her mind. But what amazed the old woman most was something she had never thought possible. Lucas began to understand human words, and eventually, even speak. He imitated her voice tenderly, uttering simple phrases. One day, looking at her with his shining eyes, he said softly, "Thank you, Grandma." Dona Rosa felt her eyes moisten. She stroked his head affectionately and replied, "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, son." The cabin was filled with life, laughter, and warmth. But not everyone saw Lucas the same way. Rumors began to spread through the town. Some said Dona Rosa lived with a supernatural animal. Others claimed Lucas was a spirit in disguise or a bad omen. Fear grew, and with it, distrust. The neighbors were worried. How could a monkey talk like a person? What kind of creature was that? Until one day, Dona Rosa fell seriously ill. Lucas, desperate to see that his beloved grandmother hadn't woken up, ran to the village looking for help. But the neighbors, overcome by fear and ignorance, caught him, thinking he was a threat. They tied him up, ignoring his moans of anguish, while he tried to show them with gestures what was happening. It was then that a kind-hearted neighbor, Dona Carmen, looked into Lucas's eyes and sensed something different. She saw no evil or danger, only sadness and despair. Soon, others began to notice the same. There was love in his eyes, urgency in his actions. They realized he wasn't a monster, but a loyal being who only wanted to save the one who cared for him. "She's trying to take us with her," said one of the neighbors. "She's not an evil spirit. She's just a worried son." Moved, they loosened Lucas's bonds and began to follow him. The large ape, still agitated, led them swiftly along the forest path, without stopping for a second. Behind him, a group of villagers who were beginning to understand the meaning of true loyalty. Lucas's farewell. The doubts and fears the neighbors felt toward Lucas gradually faded as they saw the loyalty and love with which he guided them. But when they arrived at Dona Rosa's cabin, the silence they encountered was deeper than any fear. Grandma had died. Lucas ran to her lifeless body, knelt beside her, and tenderly took her hand. His eyes, once full of life, now reflected an indescribable pain. He didn't make a sound, he just looked at her, as if trying to memorize her face for the last time. He caressed her cheek with an almost human tenderness, saying a silent goodbye. The neighbors, witnesses of that heartbreaking scene, couldn't contain their emotions. Tears welled up on many faces. It was then that they understood that what united Lucas and Dona Rosa was something sacred, something that transcended any boundaries between species, a pure, real love. From that day on, Lucas changed. Without his companion, his guide, his adoptive mother, he sank into sadness. He would spend hours, days at a time, sitting by Dona Rosa's grave, as if waiting for her to embrace him once more. He remembered her soft voice, her caresses, the warmth of that now empty home. Sometimes she would let out a soft moan, almost like a broken whisper, the lament of a soul left alone. Eventually, Lucas returned to the forest. However, his enormous figure and silent presence began to reawaken the village's old fears. The monkey ghost was said to haunt the night. Some children claimed to have seen him wandering through the village in search of food. Mothers began locking up their children, and men set up night guards with sticks, knives, and torches. Fear grew. And with fear, violence. One night, as Lucas wandered the village, starving, he was surrounded by a group of men. They pointed spears at him and shouted as if they were facing a beast. Lucas didn't attack. He didn't let out a single roar. He just stared at them, confused, fearful, with his large, sad eyes. But its imposing size, and its silence, only reinforced the villagers' terror. In seconds, they managed to trap him with a thick rope. They chained him and locked him in an old cellar on the edge of town. Lucas tried to free himself, not to escape, but to return to the place where he had once been happy. But the bonds were too strong. He could only stay still, looking through the bars at those who had once seen him play, help, laugh. He didn't understand why they treated him like that. And yet, I didn't hate. I just looked at them sadly, hoping someone would remember what once was. One of the village elders, Dona Purification, approached him one day, her heart heavy. She carefully observed Lucas's gaze, his expression. In those eyes, she saw no anger, no malice, no threat. "Are you looking for Dona Rosa?" he asked in a trembling voice. Lucas nodded slowly, and in a barely audible whisper, he replied, "Grandma isn't here. I miss her." There was total silence. The neighbors who were present lowered their gaze. Their prejudices began to crumble. That being, whom they had called a monster, was just a loyal son who missed the man who raised him. Lucas's legacy. The village chief, deeply moved by the sadness reflected in Lucas's eyes, raised a hand to calm those present. Then, in a firm but compassionate voice, he asked for his release. The ropes that kept him tied were slowly loosened. However, Lucas didn't move. He didn't run away or celebrate his freedom. He remained there, motionless, head down, his gaze lost in thought, as if all the light inside him had gone out with Dona Rosa's departure. It was at that moment that many understood something they couldn't deny. The love and loyalty of that being surpassed what most humans were capable of feeling. They no longer saw him as a danger, a myth, or a threat. They saw him for what he truly was, a broken-hearted son. The chief then proposed to accompany him, in silence, to the place where Dona Rosa was resting. So, a group of villagers walked with him, no longer afraid, but with respect. Upon arriving, Lucas knelt beside the grave. With his large hands, he tenderly caressed the earth, as if he could still feel the warmth of the one who had given him everything. He sat down again in silence, without tears, but with such a profound expression that no one dared interrupt him. "He's just a child," the village chief murmured. "A son who lost his mother." The words resonated in everyone's hearts. From then on, Lucas was accepted as part of the community. Although he never occupied a house or asked for anything, the villagers left food near the grave, and some, in silence, sat with him for a few moments. He had gone from being a threat to a symbol of love and fidelity. Day after day, Lucas visited Dona Rosa's grave. He cared for it, cleaned it, and stayed for long hours, as if time didn't exist. But something inside him was beginning to change. Although the town accepted him, he felt like he didn't quite belong in that world. "I missed Dona Rosa with a void that no human gesture could fill." And so, as the months passed, his silence grew longer, and his visits to the village fewer. Until one day, quietly, Lucas slipped into the woods. No one saw him leave, but some neighbors sensed he had made a decision. "I was returning to nature, to that wild and free world where, perhaps, I would find the peace I so desperately needed." Since then, he never appeared in the village again. However, his memory remained present. Sometimes, on cold mornings, neighbors would find enormous footprints at the edge of the woods, as if Lucas were secretly approaching, watching over those who had once judged him and then accepted him. One particularly dark night, the villagers heard a deep roar coming from the jungle. Alarmed, they prepared to defend themselves, believing danger was lurking. But at dawn, they found the tracks of wild animals surrounding the village, and among them, Lucas's large footprints. There was no doubt. He had returned silently, just to protect them. And even though they couldn't see him anymore, they knew he was still there. Somewhere in the forest, true to his essence, loyal to the end. An invisible guardian, a symbol of eternal love. Lucas, the guardian of the forest. After his departure to the heart of the mountains, Lucas's figure did not fade from people's memories. On the contrary, his silent absence began to generate an even deeper feeling of respect. The villagers began to believe that Lucas, from the shadows of the trees, was watching over them. Whenever something strange or dangerous approached the village, a pack of animals, a fire, even a storm, there were always signs. Broken branches, huge footprints, traces that showed someone had already acted before. Someone protecting them without expecting anything in return. Little by little, Lucas became a legend. Children grew up hearing stories about the guardian of the forest, a wise, strong, and noble being who watched from the hilltops and who had once lived with a kind old woman named Dona Rosa. The older ones told how he cared for her grave with devotion, like a faithful son, and how he had chosen to disappear to continue protecting the village from his true home, nature. Generations passed, but Luke's story lived on, told by the warmth of the fire or on starry nights, when the trees swayed in the wind and it seemed someone was watching them with love. "Never forget Lucas," the elders said. "He's still out there, even if we don't see him." And when some child asked why he never returned, they answered wisely, "Because he doesn't need to be seen. It's enough to know he's there." They started calling Lucas the guardian of traditions, or simply HID, from his initials. His name became a symbol of respect and gratitude. Some still claim to have seen his silhouette among the trees, and occasionally, large footprints are found by the river or near the fields. Although its form no longer lingers among the houses, its spirit remains firmly in the soul of the people. It is more than a monkey, more than a memory. It is an eternal link between humans and nature. Lucas, the guardian of the forest, will live forever in the hearts of those who once knew him, and those who, generation after generation, will continue to tell his story. May God's peace, mercy, and blessings be with you. This is the story of a shocking debate between a senior Christian priest, known for his arrogance, and a Muslim boy of just 10 years old, whose intelligence surprised everyone. Although he was initially underestimated and even mocked, the boy managed to expose the priest, leaving the entire church silent during a competition over the knowledge of 2 sacred texts. It all started one afternoon in a large church located in the city center. The place was completely packed. Christian parishioners from different neighborhoods, they came closer to listen to the pastor Antonio, who was dressed in a shining robe and displayed a confident and haughty expression. With a commanding voice, he greeted the audience and issued a provocation. "Where are the brave Muslims? Don't they keep saying their religion is the true one? Today I challenge them to prove it. But as always, they'll surely hide behind absurd excuses." Laughter and applause soon filled the room. Many mocked, convinced that no Muslim would dare to respond to Anthony's challenge. Meanwhile, in a small mosque on the other side of town, some Muslim religious leaders discussed with concern, looking for someone with enough knowledge to answer the priest's challenge. But when everyone was hesitating, a boy named Mateo stood up. "I'll go," he said in a calm but determined voice. He had a slender body, deep eyes, and the face of an innocent child, but behind his appearance lay a brilliant mind and a firm faith. Hearing this, the adults present smiled, thinking he was joking. But Mateo began to argue with conviction. "It doesn't matter what title the priest holds. If what he says isn't true, we shouldn't fear him. Islam is the true religion, and that's reason enough to respond courageously." Matthew's clarity and firmness finally convinced those present. Thus, they asked him to represent the Muslim community in the debate that would take place the following day. When morning comes, the church was even more crowded than the day before. There was an expectant silence. The Christians sat comfortably in their pews, while in a discreet corner, the Muslims watched calmly. Mateo walked in calmly, dressed in simple clothes. His mere presence made some people stop laughing. Pastor Antonio tried to belittle him with sarcastic words, mocking his age and appearance. But Mateo just smiled, remaining calm. His confidence didn't come from ego, but from knowledge and faith. Finally, the church bells rang, signaling the start of the long-awaited debate. The crowd held its breath. Antonio smiled with a superior air, while Mateo stood serenely, ready to face a moment that would mark a turning point. Pastor Antonio took a step forward. His face reflected a confident smile, while the applause of his congregation boosted his ego. From across the room, Mateo the Muslim boy stood calmly, holding his copy of the Quran firmly. His gaze didn't waver. It was fixed on the shepherd, without a hint of fear. "Very well, lad," said Antonio, arrogantly crossing his arms. "You claim to have the truth, so let's start with something simple. Islam, according to you, is a religion of compassion. So why does your holy book command you to fight?" Antonio emphasized that last word defiantly, looking at his people, who nodded in approval. The mood seemed to be leaning in his favor. But Mateo was unfazed. "The struggle mentioned in the Quran is not out of hatred or conquest, but in defense," he responded clearly. "If you consider the context properly, it becomes clear. In chapter Al-Baqarah, verse 190, it says, 'Fight in the cause of God against those who fight you, but do not transgress. God does not love aggressors.'" Matthew paused, then added, "Even in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, it is mentioned how God commands the children of Israel to enter into battle. So, can Islam alone be blamed for containing passages about war?" The silence stretched for a few seconds. Some were beginning to see that the boy spoke with solid arguments. Antonio, however, didn't give up. In a more provocative tone, he asked another question. "You say your God is merciful, but he also punishes. Can someone who forgives also be the one who condemns?" Some attendees applauded, believing that the shepherd had caught the child. But Mateo calmly replied, "Justice demands responsibility. A judge who punishes a criminal is neither just nor without compassion. God does not oppress or punish without reason. His punishment is a consequence of human injustice. Is a judge cruel for applying the law?" The congregation began to murmur. Some seemed uncomfortable. It was evident that the child's response had touched deep chords. Antonio, nervous, smiled sarcastically, but found no immediate response. The audience's initial confidence was fading. Determined to change his approach, Antonio now sought a more emotional question. "All right, kid. Let's talk about Jesus then. In the Quran, in the chapter on Mary, verses 33 and 34, it says that Jesus was blessed from birth, that he died and rose again. Doesn't that prove he's God?" Mateo smiled respectfully, as if he had already answered that question many times. "Jesus," he said, "is an honorable prophet in Islam. But he is not God. That passage highlights a miracle God granted him, as he did for Moses when he parted the sea, or for Abraham when he was saved from the fire. Do those miracles make Moses or Abraham gods?" Then he added, "God is one, without equal. And the one who has the power to perform miracles is he, not the prophets. They are merely instruments of his will." A deep silence fell over the room. The laughter from the beginning was no longer audible. Many were seriously reflecting. For the first time in the debate, some members of the audience looked down. Others exchanged puzzled gestures. Antonio struggled to maintain his authority, but his voice had lost its strength. He no longer had complete control of the room. Meanwhile, Mateo was still standing, calm, without raising his voice, but with a conviction that he demolished arguments with the force of truth. The discussion was becoming increasingly tense. Antonio tried to raise more objections, but his words no longer had the same impact. The atmosphere had changed. What had begun as a mocking spectacle had turned into an unexpected lesson of faith and wisdom. Pastor Antonio, he began to look increasingly uncomfortable. His once firm and confident face now showed signs of nervousness. As the congregation watched him expectantly, Mateo he remained calm, with the Quran in his hand, unintimidated. "You mentioned something from the Quran about Jesus," Matthew said in a calm voice. "It's true, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 171, Jesus is recognized as the Messiah, a great prophet, a spirit sent by God. But that doesn't make him God. The Quran also speaks of Adam, created without a father or mother. Does that mean Adam is God? Of course not." Antonio shifted in his seat. Each of the boys' arguments was clear, logical, and difficult to refute. He tried to maintain his position, but his confidence was fading from his eyes. Mateo did not stop. Islam teaches that every human being is responsible for their actions. If there is no justice, then where is divine balance? If someone commits a crime, as Sarah did in your example, shouldn't they face the consequences? Wouldn't a God who doesn't hold wrongdoers accountable be unjust? The silence became thick. The congregation, which had previously laughed at the boy, now looked at him with awe and respect. Some even had tears in their eyes. It wasn't just what Matthew said, but how he said it, with humility, but with truth. Antonio swallowed. His voice wouldn't come out. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. He tried to hide it, raising his hand to calm his people, but himself was no longer at peace. Matthew noticed it. Without arrogance, but with deep compassion, he raised his hand gently and said, "Sorry, Pastor. What you mentioned is only part of it. The teachings about forgiveness and sacrifice are also found in Islam. But in addition to faith, God demands righteousness and devotion. Belief isn't enough if you don't live justly." Before the pastor could respond, Matthew continued, quoting, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 72, it says, "Certainly those who say that God is the Messiah, son of Mary, have fallen into disbelief." The Messiah himself said, "O children of Israel, worship God, my Lord and your Lord." Matthew lowered the Quran respectfully and concluded, "If you can't answer clearly, Pastor, how can we trust what you teach?" The boy's words fell like a lightning bolt on Antonio's heart. He froze completely. He wanted to speak, but his throat was dry. Not even his own thoughts could rescue him. It was as if every word Mateo spoke had pierced his soul. And then something happened that no one expected. Some people from the congregation began to approach the boy. They no longer looked at him with mockery or skepticism. They looked at him with hope. One of them hugged him. Others simply sat nearby, silent, as if trying to assimilate everything they had experienced. Antonio stood still. I felt neither anger nor pride. Just emptiness. For the first time, he sincerely doubted his own beliefs. Was it possible that the truth had come from a child? Was it possible that he had been wrong all his life? The debate ended without a winner being declared. But for those present, the answer was clear. Antonio hadn't just lost the argument. He'd lost his pride, and perhaps his faith as well. There was only one thing left to do: stop Matthew. But even that couldn't work. Because how do you stop the truth when it's already been planted in hearts? And now what? That was the question that kept echoing in the pastor's mind. Antonio. The same night that Mateo, he left the room with a calm step. A silent restlessness took hold of the church. It was no longer just the shame of a lost debate. It was the seed of a truth that had begun to germinate in many hearts. The room, once filled with applause and mocking laughter, now seemed like a different place. Amid the shelves filled with books and years of repeated sermons, Antonio remained silent, consumed by thoughts he had never allowed before. The questions Mateo had asked kept echoing in his mind. Is God one and only? Can anyone else share his divinity? Is it fair that sin be paid for without personal responsibility? Trembling, Antonio approached his desk there, hidden among several books, took the copy of the Quran which he had acquired months before with the intention of refuting it. He never imagined he would open it with his heart so disarmed. He flipped through it with trembling hands. Seeing the first words, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, he felt something inside him break. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. They weren't just words. They were a caress to the wounded soul. He continued reading. He reached the verse 2 of Surah Al-Baqarah. This is the book in which there is no doubt. A guide for those who are conscious of God. A tear ran down her cheek. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel confusion, but peace. It wasn't defeat I felt. It was surrender to a greater truth. The next morning, Matthew returned to the church. The atmosphere was different. Some of the faithful, who had mocked him the night before, now looked at him with respect. Many had spent the night awake, questioning their beliefs. Some even approached to ask more about Islam, motivated not by pressure, but by genuine curiosity. Matteo, as always, responded with humility. While talking to some curious people in a corner, Antonio appeared. He looked tired, but there was something new in his gaze: sincerity. He approached slowly. Matteo saw him coming, but he didn't show any superiority. Only respect. "The truth doesn't impose itself," Matteo said sweetly. "It only knocks on the door of the heart. We decide whether to open it." Antonio nodded silently. He took a deep breath, fighting back the emotion. That same night, before a small group of faithful, the shepherd Antonio confessed his new faith with a trembling but firm voice. He declared his belief in known God and recognized Muhammad as his messenger. At that moment, the pastor stopped being just a religious leader and became a seeker of truth, not out of debate, nor out of pride, but out of a faith revealed to him through the words of a child.